Welcome to the Ethiopian Policy Institute. The Ethiopian Policy Institute is dedicated to in-depth research and analysis on Ethiopian public policy. In addition to the Institute's written contents available at ethiopianpolicy.com, the Institute's video content will cover pressing public policy topics with leading experts, both academics and policy practitioners. My name is Biruk Haregu. I'm a researcher in public policy and the political economy of development in Africa. On today's program, we cover the Ethiopian economy. I'll discuss the current state and future outlook of the Ethiopian economy with Dr. Mussie Delelegn. Dr. Mussie is a senior economist and head of the Productive Capacities and Sustainable Development branch at the United Nations Trade and Development's Division for Africa, Least Developed Countries, and Special Programs. I'm grateful to him for joining the Ethiopian Policy Institute for this important and timely conversation on the Ethiopian economy. The views and opinions expressed in our conversation today are personal, and they do not reflect the views and opinions of UNCTAD or the United Nations. Dr. Mussie, welcome to the Ethiopian Policy Institute.
Thank you, Biruk, for having me, and I'm very pleased to be with you and with the Ethiopian Policy Institute today, and I'm looking forward to our conversations on the Ethiopian economy.
Likewise, thank you. And so our conversation today will be organized in two parts. First part, we'll look at the current state of the Ethiopian economy, particularly looking at the ongoing liberalization and privatization agenda, or what the authorities are calling the reform agenda. And the second part of our conversation will focus on macroeconomic imbalances. So what are these imbalances? What are some of the root causes? What are some policy options to consider? And then ultimately short, medium, and long-term forecasts or outlooks for the Ethiopian economy. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with the first part of our conversation, Dr. Mussie. And so in the beginning, as I have outlined, we're going to start with a discussion of the current state of the economy. So how do you see the current state, the macroeconomy in particular? So what are some of its characteristics? How do you characterize it? Keeping in mind some of the changes that are taking place, especially over the last several years, the liberalization, privatization agenda. So what's sort of the overall macro level picture?
Thank you very much again. As you know, over the last couple of decades, the Ethiopian economy has performed well relative to many countries in the region. That performance led to modest reduction in extreme poverty levels every year. And then the economy, the GDP has also improved a lot, although still this is in terms of nominal values, the GDP has reached close to $160 billion US, 2023 figure, but in real terms, which means adjusted to inflation and also constant, it is estimated to be around $130 billion US. So this progress on the whole is driven by public investment and improved external aid environment in general. Ethiopia used to be one of the darlings of donors since the 1990s. There were huge investment in infrastructure, not only physical infrastructure, but also in the social sectors. The school and health facilities have improved a lot, to a great deal, although the qualities were still at their infancy. Economy generally was regarded as one of the fastest growing economies, Sub-Saharan Africa in particular. But that being said, the changes we have seen, the growth that we have seen has not really transformed the economy the way it should have. For example, the capital accumulation, what we call it the gross fixed capital formation, is not commensurate with what that high level of economic growth would generate in general. That level has not led to substantial job creation. It has not led to substantial poverty reduction as well. The economy remains largely locked in what we call it structural impediments and remained one of the most vulnerable economies in the world, vulnerable to various sorts of shocks, be they political, economic, or environmental. So consequently, what we witnessed was the investment in productive capacities has been lagging behind. So Ethiopia's productive capacities were one of the lowest among the developing countries. It ranked 168 or 69 in 2022 out of 193, 94 economies of the world. And that means our capacity to produce goods and services, diversify our economies, create decent jobs for the population and the youth, significantly the level of poverty, and build particularly resilience to shocks has been one of the lowest in the region. So that is one particular area that requires further investigation, further studies, and the scaling up of also efforts in terms of addressing the low productivity, low competitiveness of the economy. The second area is that we have seen, particularly recently, is macroeconomic instabilities. These are structural, some are institutional, some are policy induced. Of course, I hope we will go into the details of this. The private sector of Ethiopia is one of the weakest, even by the sub-Saharan African standards. So it's a bit stifled private sector that the economy has. So without dynamic and vibrant private sector, it will be difficult for the Ethiopian economy to address some of these structural, systemic, and persistent vulnerabilities in the economy. As you know, political instability is part of the problem. Actually, that is defining both the history and the current state of the Ethiopian economy. It seems that we have not learned enough from our own past histories. Still, conflict is very much a defining feature of the Ethiopian economy. And as we know, economies will not thrive when there are conflicts and political instabilities. The other issue, weak institutions also is part of the game. These are the areas that require careful investigation, careful reforms as well, reforms that are driven by local demand, local needs. We will discuss about that as well. High external indebtedness is still part of the problem of the equation when we speak about the Ethiopian economy. Stubborn inflation is still part of the bigger problem that is not only facing policymakers at home, but also the ordinary people on the streets. So these are generally the kind of challenges that we see in the current Ethiopian economic situation. Of course, the confluences of all these problems is that it locks the economies, what we call it, in a low level equilibrium trap, which means low growth or unstable growth or fragile growth, low impact on poverty or the generalized poverty situation where poverty afflicts the large majority of the population. As you know, recently the UNDP and the Oxford University issued the new set of multidimensional poverty index, where they found close to 74% of our population, unfortunately, is locked in multidimensional poverty. That's poverty in education, poverty in health, poverty in all parameters, which afflicts large majority of the economy.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Mussie, for that macro level look at the Ethiopian economy. We'll certainly come back to some of the things that the policymakers, decision makers ought to consider going forward in the second half of our discussion. Bring us back to some of the structural issues. You've mentioned lack of productive capacities, so a lack of investments in key sectors, a lack of investments in things like education, job creation. Of course, in addition to the conflict, what's increasingly happened is a reduction in foreign direct investments. All of it combining to one of the structural challenges we face is the chronic foreign exchange issue that the economy faces. So as we keep all that in mind, there's currently a quote-unquote reform process being undertaken, seemingly to address some of these significant constraints. Part of this is policymakers say that the lack of private sector being a key engine of growth has been a major impediment to economic growth and development. So there's a wholesale privatization and liberalization agenda that's currently being undertaken. How do you assess that quote unquote reform, liberalization, privatization agenda in the context that you've outlined, which is the global environment isn't particularly favorable for developing countries, especially in terms of attracting foreign direct investment, foreign aid, etc. So how do you think about opening up, essentially, privatization, liberalization in the current climate where investment is essentially drying up? And how do you assess the reforms as they've been rolled out over the last couple of years?
Thank you, Biruk, again. You see, there is nothing in undertaking reforms. But we see in the context of Africa, and including my own country in Ethiopia, reforms are always dictated by external policy prescriptions. That is one of the problems, one of the fundamental problems that we have with the reforms, which means the domestic or local conditions, whether it is macroeconomic conditions, the unemployment situation of the labor market, the productivity issue that we have been talking about, these are often neglected or forgotten. So there is a kind of prescription, exogenization of domestic policies in Africa in particular. And the problem of that kind of exogenization of domestic policies leads to kind of wrong targets, for example. Crowding out the domestic policy-making capabilities, weakening domestic institutions, masking some of the egregious distortions in the economy, because these are not only meant for Ethiopia, but they are the same policy prescriptions to sub-Saharan Africa. You know, there are 45, 46 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and all across those reform packages are identical or similar, which means that domestic specific country context, country-specific endowments, culture and institutions and mindsets have not been taken into account in most cases. That is, I think, one of the biggest problems that we have with externally prescribed policies. The second problem we have with policy, particularly in Africa, by the way, these kind of structural adjustment programs, they have been widely practiced also in East Asian economies, which we dealt with as part of my own professional engagements. They have been exercised in Latin America widely, but the results are not the same. So we will discuss what to differentiate those results from the reform processes later in the conversations, if time allows us. But the biggest problem, the second biggest problem, in addition to the exogenization of domestic policies and crowding out of the policy spaces, is also these reforms, most of the time, they are always predicated on the assumption that market is a panacea for all the economic ills of the economy. I mean, free market is a panacea for all the economic ills and problems that countries have been facing. So these fundamental assumptions, this is inherent assumptions in the reform processes, which are imposed in countries that could not govern the market forces itself, is a problem. So the conception that market is an answer to all the problems that countries face is it raises second set of problems for countries that are implementing, especially in sub-Saharan African countries where market forces are themselves weak and also vulnerable to shocks. The third set of policies which we have been investigating through various studies and analysis is that always governments are weak. Government policies are distortive, even if those policies are not distorted. The assumption that there is distortion in government policies, it requires, we know, the reform, but it doesn't require the imposition of those reforms from outside forces. Now, when policies are pushed on Africa, liberalization, as you say, privatization, stabilization, institutional reform, reform of the labor market, reforming the agriculture, everything is pushed on Africa in one go, as one package. Knowing that institutions are weak, knowing that capacities to absorb and implement those policy prescriptions are limited, but these policies are pushed in one package, as a package. Then countries were actually squeezed in between. So there were reforms in the macroeconomic fundamentals. There are reforms, the exchange rate, revaluation, devaluation, floating. We will touch upon this issue maybe later in the course. But the notion of the policy, that policies are not based on, they are not forward-looking, they are not problem-solving, they are not matching domestic realities of the countries. This is the problem we have with policy reforms. African countries must stop to subjecting their policy autonomies. If a nation or economies fight for political freedom, you must fight also for economic freedom. Policies, externally imposed policies will not have never resolved domestic conditions, circumstances, and will not resolve domestic problems, economic problems of society.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Mussie. I do want to reiterate some of the points that you've said, which is fundamentally with these sorts of prescriptive policy changes, which are essentially oftentimes coming from the International Monetary Fund. This isn't a new round of policies. We've seen this in the 1980s and early part of 1990s. And we know that it had detrimental effects to economies, particularly in Africa. It led to deindustrialization, it led to inflation, unemployment, hollowing out of industries and comparative advantages. So the loss of policy autonomy and essentially tying one's hand is extremely difficult and ought to be looked at. Policy making becomes outside-in process. It's a one-size-fits-all approach, as you've mentioned, which doesn't take into account country-specific contexts and conditions. So when we look at privatization and liberalization, because the policy prescriptions are, as we said, essentially the same thing. Privatize certain state-owned enterprises, essentially let individuals or multinational companies purchase and hold on to these assets. So instead of them being assets of the people through the state, they are in private hands. The question is, who is in a position to purchase these assets, and what kind of policy making continues from there? If we look at, for instance, the Soviet Union experience, then you had the privatization through shock therapy, which is, as you said, it isn't sequenced. The policy reforms are in one go, hence the term shock therapy. You have to shock the economy through these significant policy changes. It led to corruption. Who was attaining these assets? Was there institutional capacity? Was there oversight capacity to facilitate these processes? So you had the emergence of, in that context, oligarchs, individuals that are in the right place at the right time with the right resources and connections that are able to acquire assets, but they didn't benefit the people. They didn't lead to significant gains in employment, productive capacities, investments in education, human capital, et cetera, which is a huge problem. To your point about get rid of subsidies, et cetera, to the economy, the agricultural example you cited for Ethiopia, as we know, when you do remove subsidies and support for key sectors of the economy, it leaves it vulnerable to multinationals. Gaps will be filled from MNCs that are going to come into the domestic market, attain assets, or fill voids. And then what does that do to the country's economic capacity? We can go into greater details about, for instance, the Asian financial crisis, when things like this happened, where you had significant amounts of foreign capital and MNCs come into economies. At the site of any kind of instability, MNCs tend to pull out. Foreign capital tends to pull out, which has devastating effects on the local economy. Actually, it can potentially collapse and create financial crises. So all of that is at play, as we're looking at the Ethiopian context, how these policy reforms are being rolled out. Just to summarize, they are driven by the International Monetary Fund. Specifically, a year ago in July 2024, there was an agreement to begin this process. Essentially, free floating of the currency was one of the measures that were taken at that time. And there was a bailout, a financial package delivered by the IMF for $3.4 billion. So there was this inflection point that happened a year ago. Since then, we've had sort of influx in the economy. We know that foreign exchange market has been turbulent. Now let's take it to where we are today in terms of the FX market in particular, as well as the austerity measures that accompany these policy adjustments. Outside prescribed policies come with austerity measures. What does that look like? What's its effect on the lives and livelihoods of the broader population? So we discussed the policy reforms that are being undertaken, austerity measures, if we can cover that, and also let's look at the FX issue that's currently at play.
Thank you. I think that is a very reasonable point to debate on. I have been always fascinated by the success stories of the Asian countries that were prescribed the same set of policies as Africans. Now, what distinguishes Asian countries from the rest of the world, particularly East Asian, is pragmatism in policy choice. A tacit rejection of what is not working, careful identification of what works for them and what doesn't work. When they reject, it's not ideological based rejection. They reject based on reasoning, but there is tacit rejection all the time. But their policies are forward looking. Now, instead of privatizing the Asians, what they did is they reformed their state-owned enterprises. They made them very competitive, very effective, very efficient. But simultaneously, they also incentivized the private sector. Gradually, the nascent private sector, the just emerging private sector in the early 80s became gradually the dominant player in the economies of Asia. Asian economies grew through incentivizing the private sector, carefully identifying their comparative advantages, resolving key binding constraints on their economies. These are the kind of issues, the kind of success stories that led Asian economies to success. There is no envelope acceptance of policy prescriptions. This is what I wanted African countries, including Ethiopia, also do, because in early 80s, most of the Asian flying economies were almost on equal footing with some of the African countries. Now, the problem for most African countries are structural. Their exports are driven by primary commodities. Largely, these are mineral resources. Those extractive resources, the propensity of extractive resources to generate jobs, create income, this poverty is very limited because they are not labor intensive by nature. They are capital intensive, particularly the mining, the oil and sector. These are hugely capital intensive. These are not as labor-intensive as agriculture or labor-intensive manufacturing sector. For Asian growth model is to move away from the dominance of this commodity-led growth. Their growth is recalibrated, accelerated through labor-intensive manufacturing sector. But in most African countries, the manufacturing value added to GDP is on a precipitous decline. The Ethiopian was, I think, about 7% in the last 5-6 years. I think recent report I have seen indicates it's about 5.6 or 5.7. So without addressing industrial sector, when industry, I mean not industry in terms of investing in the industrial sector, but in the manufacturing sector, particularly the labor-intensive manufacturing sector, adding value to what we produce. Hooking into the regional and global value chains systematically, not in the lowest echelon of the value chain, but at the high end of the value chain. These are critically important for most of our countries. Now, the problem with our reforms, for example, exchange rate adjustment, this will not resolve structural issues, will not address some of the gaps we have in the export, some of the balances we have in our external sector. They will not contribute to addressing some of the external indebtedness we have. By the way, the Ethiopian total public debt today, including external debt, it stands about 53 or 55% of the GDP. That is colossal for the economy of the country. The exports recently, because of the improvement in international price for coffee and gold, and also some restrictions on imports, so we see a little bit of positive movement towards reducing the trade balance. But that is not sustainable because it is austerity based. The moment you curtail import without substitution, then that is considered as another austerity measure. So austerity creates more problems to the economy and to the society. So what we have to do is we have to substitute imports that we can produce locally. We have to add value to our export sector. We can't continue exporting all the time. 90% of our exports are, I think it's leather and textile and leather accounts only about 6% of the total export of the country. So close to 90% comes from, this is in the merchandise, comes from low value added production sectors. So unless we address this, these are not issues that you can address through exchange rate realignment. Exchange rate can facilitate, but it will not resolve some of the systemic, some of the structural, some of the key binding constraints that the economy has. So agents also move to the floating only once they address their development needs. Once they accumulated capital, once they created jobs, once they became competitive in the export sector, once they attracted huge amount of investment, facilitated investment flows, and then they started moving from the fixed exchange rate system to manage the exchange rate. Even today, except few countries, I think South Korea and I think Singapore. Other than that, by and large, these countries are, although sometimes they say these are a kind of de jure floating exchange rates, but the intervention capacity of governments are so huge, and still we can consider them, they are in a managed float. So we are moving ahead with liberalizing the exchange rate without addressing the unemployment problems that we have, without reducing our dependency on import, without reducing our dependency on external aid, without addressing some of the structural constraints that we have at the sectoral level, without addressing the poverty situation. Asians reduced significantly. Now, Vietnam, I worked a lot in Vietnam. The poverty rate is less than 1% now in Vietnam, just in a matter of 30, 40 years. Still, they are using a managed float. Still, the economy is state-led by and large. Policies are experimented, designed by domestic institutions, capability, they fostered capabilities at the institutional level in terms of not only formulating policies, but also implementing policies. So what I'm saying is we cannot address some of the structural problems we have by simply addressing some of these instabilities, some of the problems that we have in the exchange, in the foreign exchange environment.
Points that you've raised, the importance of value addition domestically, specifically whether it's agro-processing or the manufacturing of textiles, garments, leather goods. Much of that was state-driven, right? Ethiopia had a really robust, effective policy, what's known as the industrial parks policy or program, that was delivering real results. And one of my worries is this policy would create a significant amount of jobs, an uptick in exports. It's been neglected. This isn't just my assessment of my own research, which I've dedicated a couple of years to looking at closely, but the World Bank has written evaluation reports on this, saying it was a program that was largely delivering the results that it was supposed to deliver, and now it's being neglected. And so when you have sort of this level of austerity measures that are being put upon the state and a lack of investment, is it going to further lead to a neglect of sort of manufacturing industry, the value addition processes? Where is this level of investment going to come from when state-owned enterprises are not performing well, or they're being privatized, or they're being broken up, etc.? I think that's something that ought to be thought about very seriously. This is an engine of growth and development, and it sort of feels like we're letting it slip from our grasps over the last few years. To bring us a little bit more to the austerity measures, you mentioned how austerity affects government investment, but what about sort of at the community level, the individual level, especially things like education? What does austerity do to investments in education, investments to health, investments to the social safety net? Are there detrimental impacts? What does that look like? How will that affect Ethiopian society?
The issue you raised about austerity, in the case of sub-Saharan African countries, austerity is not only penalizing the poor. Actually, the middle class is also falling below the poverty line. That's number one issue for us to consider. The second issue, when it comes to austerity, it is not simply penalizing the economy as a whole, but it is really making the economy less competitive. As I was saying, culture, the removal of subsidies on agriculture. But more importantly, when you force government to apply discretionary financial or budgetary policies instead of expansionary budgetary policies, by the way, expansionary budgetary policies, these are the futures that also define the early phases of transformation in the Asian economies, in Latin American economies. Then you penalize some of the vital sectors in the economy. You reduce investment in education. We have seen in most sub-Saharan African countries, the moment there is a condition to discipline budgets, belt tightening budgetary approaches, what we see is the expenditure, public expenditure in education goes down significantly. Investment in health goes down significantly. Safety net arrangements for the poor, they lack financing in general to the detriment of poverty reduction. So most of our countries, which are externally indebted as well, we have seen situations where debt repayment obligations, governments save money to pay their external debts. Third largest component of the Ethiopian budget, if you look at the budget, is debt repayment. After infrastructural projects, third largest allocation is for debt repayment obligations. This means that we are spending more on debt financing than on education or health, and sometimes combined expenditures on health is less than the debt servicing obligations that we have to meet. So this is not only in Ethiopia, but in many African countries. Now, austerity for the sake of austerity, for one of the fundamental errors that market-driven policies, as if market addresses some of the glaring inequalities we have within our societies, as if market is going to heal killer diseases that most of our people suffer from, whether it's cholera, whether it is contagious, whether it's malaria. No, as if market is going to cure the economic ills of societies, we force government to reduce budget expenditures, most of the time at the expense of not only the poor, but at the expense of the economy. There are situations where governments are forced to finance, adopt expansionary policies, state-led enterprises, or enterprising of development, what we call the developmental state model. These models, which have been successful in most Asian economies, these are led by the government leading in the infrastructure sector, in the education sector, in research and development sectors. So these are the critical issues for our countries or our government to look into. What is it that we are assuming? Why is it that we are assuming a commitment is to reduce our fiscal discipline just for the sake of conditionalities policy prescription? You raised 3.4 billion. That was the financing facilities that was promised for Ethiopia by the IMF. By the admission of the government and by our own estimates, Ethiopia needs huge amount of resources, not 3.4 billion US dollars. What we estimated actually prior to the eruption of conflicts in Amhara and the Oromia region, we estimated Ethiopia needs close to 80 to 100 billion US dollars to revitalize its economy, to rebuild the war-torn economies, infrastructure, and also, all addressing all the devastation that came with war situation, particularly the labor in the Tigrayan region. So, in terms of financial needs for Ethiopia, 3.4 billion is not a huge amount of money. It's really peanuts vis-a-vis the needs. It may provide short-term liquidity, but it may not address the structural kind of needs that the government and the country requires to address some of the gaps, some of the problems that it has. So sometimes we have to know, when we trade our policy autonomy, which we raised in the first series of our conversation, we have to know for what purposes and for what goal we are sacrificing give policy autonomy to external policy prescriptions.
Thank you, Dr. Mussie. On this point of the effects of austerity, both on the macro economy, reducing investment, competitiveness, and increasing the burden on the poor, the least well-off, the middle class, is important to note. And Action Aid, which is a nonprofit, did a report looking at austerity's effects in Africa, one of the countries being Ethiopia. And they found really a tangible negative effect on education and health, both in terms of service delivery and even outcomes, which is taking us backwards. Ethiopia had made significant gains over a period of 10 to 20 years in terms of education, attainment, enrollment, and health outcomes, child and maternity health outcomes. And these measures may be taking us backwards. And some of the early reports, frankly, point to this. And the European Policy Institute did a review of that report. It was an important report worth looking at. And then this leads us to then, domestic mobilization. You mentioned there's upwards of an $80 to $100 billion financial gap for Ethiopia to strengthen its economy. What does that then look like in an environment where the global context support is largely drying up? Domestic resource mobilization, fiscal policy become very, very important. Where are we in Ethiopia as far as domestic resource mobilization? Our citizens then, because we're going to be looking at taxes, what's the effect of this domestic mobilization on the poor, the middle class, which is, frankly speaking, already largely overtaxed?
Let me highlight some of the principles. Domestic resource mobilization is vital for nations to break the dependency. I've written extensively that this dependency on official development assistance, on aid and external borrowing, that only exacerbates the vulnerabilities of sub-Saharan African economies. So we always put emphasis that domestic resource mobilization is critically important. If not in the short term, but in the long term, this must be policies of governments to reduce their dependency and vulnerabilities on external sources of financing in the future. Taxation is not the only issue to mobilize domestic resources. Let me highlight about 3-4 key principles in taxation, because this is part of the fiscal economics. Taxes on incomes and profits are actually part of the civic duties. As you know, we pay taxes wherever we are, in developed countries, in developing nations. What ties together citizenry to the state is one of the relationship in the taxation issue. So it is civic duty to pay taxes. That's, I think, one of the principles that people should not forget. But that said, there are also ways to impose taxes. So taxes should not be, for example, this should not be imposed arbitrarily. There must be transparent, accountable, and standard processes of levying taxes. You must know who to tax, for example, when to tax, and how to tax as well. The second issue, which we do not mention when we compare taxes, is actually how those taxes are structured. In most countries, this is the case in the US, in the European Union, taxes are progressive. For example, in Switzerland, if I have some figures here just to quote for you, if a single person income is less than 4,800 Swiss franc, this is close to 16,000 US dollars. they are exempt from tax. This is considered as a low-income category. So they don't pay, its tax is zero. Federal tax is zero. For people who are earning close to 16,000 US dollars, federal tax, they are exempt from federal tax. Same in France. In France, anyone getting 10,770 euros and below are exempt from tax. Now, basically, who pays tax is really the middle class, the middle income population, and the upper class in the economy. Taxes are designed not to penalize poor, but instead redistribute the gains, the economic gains, to the population at large. So this is the second principle that nations, when they go for taxation, they have to look into how taxes are. The other issue, the third principle in taxation, this is really fiscal economics. We used to call it 303. Now I think we call this one 101. It's simply that they should not be, that governments should be sensitive when they impose taxes. Sensitive means they have to know when to tax, how to tax, and also what goal to tax. Now, it is not only collecting taxes. Citizens expect from the government delivery of efficient services, whether it is education, whether it is in transport sector, in the health sector. They expect the government to deliver, to address some of the gaps. The bondage between the state and the population is not only taxes, but also the services that they get in return from government. So we need to really balance taxation. Otherwise, if we keep paying taxes, for example, in the Ethiopian case, I was looking into the policy dimension. There is tightening of existing regulations, new rules, new regulations are coming. Taxes are evolved over the years. Royalty taxes on corporate taxes have increased by 30%. Taxes over all tax revenue boomed by 80%, reached 900 billion US dollars. There is adjustment now. Yesterday or the day before yesterday, there is a discussion of adjustment of the VAT, the value added tax. There are excise tax. There are property taxes that are in the making. If you add everything, then it becomes overtaxation. Overtaxation will penalize the economy. It stifles the private sector. In fact, there are, I think, thousands of registered licenses. People stop renewing their licenses, for example, business licenses. Many thousands cancel their, kind of things. So what it brings is informality into the economy. It brings tax evasion. People will become seasoned in evading taxes. It chases out investment opportunities. The FDI, even the domestic private sector that you can think of, they fear and they will not invest in the economy. The worst thing is it encourages capital flights. So it's not only taxes, but people would involve in money laundering, in transferring what we call trade misinvoicing. A lot of those kind of problems will come. It will become inevitable when there is overtaxation. The problem is because citizens are ready to pay taxes so long as they have the ability to pay, so long as they are not unduly or arbitrarily taxed. This is what I'm trying to say. So long as taxation is reasonable, so long as they are not overtaxed, we all pay taxes wherever we are. We have to be careful. We need to balance taxation with the fundamental economic reasoning. There must be acceptable economic conditions to imposing taxes. What are acceptable economic conditions? Acceptable economic conditions are sustained and inclusive growth, is effective distribution of economic gains among the societies, corruption-free economies, capable institutions that protect the poor and the vulnerable sections of the society, vibrant and dynamic private sector, the private sector that generates jobs, that provide improve the income of the population. then people will be willing to pay taxes because they built their capacity to pay taxes. The second issue is also they have to see what benefit they are going to get from taxation. What are the kind of government services effectively, efficiently they will be getting in return from the government. We need to balance these kind of issues. Just recent studies, just to quote some figures, Ethiopia loses 3% of the GDP through illicit financial outflows. 3% of the GDP, that is huge by any stretch of the imagination. That is equivalent to 30% of the government revenue. That is equivalent to 90% of the country's export. So unless we rein in capital flight or illicit financial flows from Ethiopia, then overtaxation may even exacerbate the situation. So we need to be really careful. It is in the range of every year, the data I got, this is, by the way, from the Africa Development Bank and also from the Global Financial Integrity. So Ethiopia loses huge amount of resources every year through illicit financial outflows. These are illegal financial outflows. They live through export under invoicing and import over invoicing. These are ways of sending the resources or the money you have outside of the country. Invest anywhere and elsewhere instead of investing in your own country. My advice to the government, instead of overtaxation, of course, they established some of the institutions. For example, they created them. The Ministry of Revenue is looking into ways of curbing illicit financial flows. By the way, illegal trade as well, in the non-official trade, is also contribute to capital outflight or illegal resource flow. There is National Financial Intelligence Committee. The enforcement capabilities, the financial intelligence that we have is not able to curb these kind of problems we have. My advice is, instead of overtaxing the business, overtaxing the citizens, I think we need to do better in terms of dealing with invoicing, in terms of addressing some of the capital flights that we have. That will really boost our capacity to mobilize domestic resources beyond overtaxing the citizens, which eventually may create some problems between the legitimacy under question. Let me rephrase this one, may question the legitimacy and credibility of government policies. If overtaxation becomes central for the government's mobilization of domestic resources, be for expanding job opportunities, be for addressing the structural weaknesses that the economy has, be for addressing some of the gaps we have in terms of some of the huge financial outflows we have due to the illicit financial flows. These are key issues for us to address fundamentally. Making the private sector, domestic private sector, there are a series of binding constraints on the Ethiopian private sector. Addressing those constraints, including improving access to finance, the electricity outage, infrastructure problem, high cost of transport, because our country pays close to 30–40% of the exports actually is a transport cost. So we need to address those need to make our exports less bureaucratic, our export logistics very efficient, very effective, to the point reducing the transport costs for producers and traders. These are the issues we need to address. If not, overtaxation will not resolve the problems, the liquidity problem that countries such as Ethiopia have. The institutions that prescribe policies have also these artificial benchmarks that the tax must be 20% of the GDP of the country, without looking into the sources of GDP. What drives GDP in Ethiopia? Ethiopia's GDP is driven largely by agriculture. 40% of the GDP, nearly 40% of the GDP comes from agriculture sector. Agriculture contributes only 2% of taxes for the government. So there is no way for economies that are hugely reliant and dependent on agriculture, not only agriculture, but very backward agriculture, agriculture that's rain-fed, that is vulnerable to environmental and climate changes. Agriculture that is producing a small plot of land. It will be difficult to augment taxation to 20% of the GDP. We need to look. And the second main driver of the GDP is the informal services sector. The informal services sector, how are we going to tax the informal sector? How are we going to do the micro and the small enterprises that are sometimes just self-owned, just to help family go on their daily operations? So it will be difficult. We need to see what drives growth. What is the source of the GDP that is taxable? As we say, the manufacturing value added of Ethiopia is declining over time. It's about 6.4% of the GDP now, 6.5% of the GDP. How much tax that is going to contribute? So the burden of taxation will be coming to the informal sector for the poor in many countries that's exempt from relative poor, exempt from taxation. Now, in our case, we will be forced to, because they have to reach that magic threshold level. I think there is a plan to increase taxation by 1% of the GDP every year. And for the next 10, 15 years, or maybe 7 to 10 years, the plan is to share of the GDP share of taxation to make it reach 20%. So this will be difficult if we don't know the source. If it's single sectors are driving the economy, these sectors are vulnerable themselves. It will be difficult to provide a basis for taxation in the Africa, not only in Ethiopia, but in sub-Saharan Africa, the level of 20%. So we need to be careful. Governments must balance their development priorities vis-a-vis the revenue that they are going to generate. And they must also provide in return the service that the people expect. For peace and the political stability for Ethiopia will become critical as we move forward, because you mentioned what is the future for Ethiopia. If we continue spending on war and conflicts and rehabilitation, reconstruction, time and again, then whatever amount of resources the government mobilize domestically will not be sufficient to address some of the glaring gaps that we see in the economy, in the financing model, or in the IMF policy prescriptions.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Mussie. I'll definitely come back to future outlooks a little bit later, but I do want to emphasize a linkage between overtaxation of individuals through their income, essentially. A lot of times, public sector employees, for example, whose incomes have been stagnant, and in terms of real income, they've actually been decreasing when we take inflation into account, to continue to increase taxes is, as the saying goes, like beating a dead horse. Is you're milking this segment of the population whose income isn't rising and who is experiencing poverty. Poverty rates are increasing. To your point, UNDP Oxford University study showed that yes, about 70% of the population, 73% is in multidimensional poverty. If we take into account those on the cusp of multidimensional poverty, that actually rises to about 90% of the population. So really need to think long and hard about this, as well as taxing businesses, which be leading to informality, corruption, the effects of corruption and all of this, and then the illicit financial flows to tax havens, resources going abroad rather than being reinvested domestically. Much to think about, frankly speaking. And let's now transition to the second part. In part two of my conversation on the Ethiopian economy with Dr. Mussie, we discuss structural macroeconomic imbalances, public sector spending on vanity projects, or what the authorities call corridor developments. We highlight the importance of dynamic comparative advantage and policy continuity for sustainable socioeconomic growth and development. We discuss trade policy in light of recent U.S. tariffs on Ethiopia and its implications for Ethiopia's trade, and we conclude with the discussion on a future outlook of the Ethiopian economy. Be sure to stay tuned for that conversation and much more by subscribing to the Ethiopian Policy Institute's YouTube channel and by following the Institute's social media accounts @Ethiopian Policy. Thank you for your support.